Hello, everyone. Welcome to the University of the Underground. We are a free, pluralistic, and transnational university and charity founded in 2017 in the basement of a nightclub. I am Naum, the health program of I Want to Believe, an investigation into religion and belief systems as a part of a 3-month practice-based residency where we are going to unravel belief systems and the relationship with politics, economics, society. I would like to welcome our participants and researchers, and also to any visiting participants. And if you're watching this, I kindly request you to help us by supporting this program and donate anything that you can. So go to our website of University of the Underground and hit that donate button. Today we're going to have a talk. It's going to be 40 minutes, and then we're going to have 15 minutes for Q&A. If you have any questions, drop them on the chat, and I will be calling you at the end. So I'm very excited because today we have a very special guest, Aaron Tugendhaft. So Aaron is a scholar of the ancient Middle East and a dedicated humanities teacher focusing on religion, political philosophy, and the arts. He received his PhD from the Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies at New York University in 2012, and also holds a degree in art and history and social thought from the University of Chicago. He has held postdoctoral fellowships at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, the W.F. Albright Institute of Archaeological Research in Jerusalem, and the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. He has edited various books, but his most recent one is The Idols of Isis, From Assyria to the Internet, where Aaron explores the political power of images and the significance of their destruction. So it's going to be a very intriguing lecture, and Aaron, we are all yours.
Thanks so much for inviting me to join you this afternoon, or at least where I am in Berlin, it's afternoon. And so thanks. Basically, my thought, and hopefully this will work for you, is to run you through a kind of a number of images from through a PowerPoint that are related to the book that was just mentioned that I recently published, The Idols of Isis, From Assyria to the Internet. It's not exactly identical to the argument of the book. It's sort of its own little thing, but it's very similar. And yeah, and so hopefully I'll try to get through it in 40 minutes, and then we can have time for discussion. And then I'm curious to get your thoughts and thoughts about how it might connect to some of the other things that you've been working on in this program. So let's share screen. Everyone see this okay? Great. So as many of you probably remember, in February 2015, the Islamic State released a video onto the internet of destruction in the Mosul Museum in northern Iraq. This was at a time when the Islamic State had been rampaging through northern Iraq for a while and had been releasing a number of videos, some far more gruesome. But this one made a mark, at least in my circle, as somebody who professionally is a student of the ancient Near East and ancient archaeology. And so when this video came out, it went pretty viral, at least on the social medias, of that I was linked into. And so when I saw this video, after sort of seeing it and getting having the first shock, I noticed one thing in particular that really struck my eye. One of the scenes, a sort of key scene in the video, shows 3 men with sledgehammers smashing the sculpture of a king. And I immediately recognized this uncanny resemblance between this moment in the video and a small part of an ancient Assyrian relief sculpture from the palace of Sargon II at Khorsabad from around 700, 600 BC. So both images, as you can see, show three men with sledgehammers smashing the sculpture of a king. You can tell it's a king by the sort of the headdress on each of them, and with the statue laying horizontally. And so, you know, I knew about the image on the right because actually I had used it as the cover of an anthology that I had edited called Idle Anxiety. But other than putting it on the cover, I had never really thought about it before. Right, and the image itself, as you might notice, right, is itself that I'm showing you here as a drawing. It's not the original. The original relief sculpture, which was excavated in the mid-19th century, actually is probably somewhere at the bottom of the Tigris River right now. It probably sank when it was being shipped by the French down to Basra to be taken to Paris. But the drawing that we have here was made in situ by an artist that was sent by the French excavation team, and so we know about the image. And so Khorsabad is located 25 kilometers away from Mosul, and so the initial question that I asked myself, right, is what can we make of the relationship between these two images, made 2,500 years apart from each other, and yet only 25 kilometers apart from each other, right? And more generally, what underlies this impulse to destroy images, and not less important, the impulse to make images of that destruction, right? So here we have not only iconoclasm, and by which I mean the destruction of images, but very much the making of images. These are both images, right, of that iconoclasm. And so what's behind that? And specifically in my work, I've been thinking about it from a perspective of political perspective, though the line between the political and the religious, at least depending on how you approach such questions, is a very fine line. The main theorist underlining my entire work on this project is the medieval Islamic philosopher Al-Farabi, whose book on religion is very much a book on politics. So for me, at least, these two really do blend into each other. And I can say a little bit more about that as we go on. So this was the starting point. At the same time, there's a kind of personal aspect to the project, and I'll just share that with you briefly. On my mother's side, I'm descended from Iraqi Jews who had been living in Iraq along the Tigris probably since the destruction of the first temple in antiquity. And my grandfather, who was born in, I see that there's a question in the chat. We'll get to, I'll get to that when we get there. So my grandfather was born in Iraq and participated, like many of the members of the Jewish community, which was a very significant community, 30% or so of Baghdad at the time, participated in the formation of the modern state of Iraq when after Iraqi independence in 1929. And Iraq in general, and Baghdad in particular at the time, was an incredibly mixed, diverse, very pluralistic space. Not only were there members of the new Iraqi polity, like my grandfather was Jewish, but he was integrated and involved in making this new state together with Muslims, both Sunni and Shia, with Christians, with atheists, with Marxists, with capitalists, with a whole bunch of different types of people that were involved in different ways in trying to form this new nation. At the same time, my grandfather was in Baghdad in June 1941 during the Farhud, which was a pogrom that left nearly 200 members of the Jewish community dead, and which precipitated his leaving Iraq, first for Tehran, where my mother was born, and then eventually to Tel Aviv, and from Tel Aviv to New York, which is where I was born and raised. And I mention this because for me, this project is about this question of maintaining plurality, how we can maintain plurality in political projects when that plurality is incredibly fragile, and how easy it is for us to try to end up polarizing ourselves into groups in which we feel more comfortable, and the threat to real politics that entails. And behind these thoughts lies some of Hannah Arendt's work on the necessity of plurality in politics, which of course is itself based on Aristotle's definition of a polis as a space that maintains plurality. He uses a musical metaphor. For those of you familiar with Aristotle, he uses a musical metaphor. He says that what you want is melody, right? And to avoid the two extremes, right? The one extreme would be so that there's so much diversity, but with no coherence at all, that you would just get cacophony on the one hand, but on the other hand, you also want to avoid such a homogenization such that you would just get what he calls a single beat, right? And so it's really in trying to find a way to achieve plurality politically that allows for politics in this tradition. And here, just to give you a sense of a little bit more of this, the leaving of the Jews from Iraq was really just a sort of first stage in the homogenization and polarization of Iraq in a lot of ways. And here, these are maps that show the awful, and just one form of the awful implications of the American-led invasion. You see before 2006, all of the yellow, these are neighborhoods of Baghdad that are mixed, Sunni and Shia, and you can see how under the pressure of the under the pressure of the invasion leads to more and more polarization, such that and this is the map on the right is quite old already, but shows you how it led to more homogenization and polarization. And of course, the events in 2015 in northern Iraq just can be a continuation of this kind of story, where the Islamic State was rampaging through and terrorizing Shia and Yazidi and Assyrian and other minority communities, and leading towards more and more homogenization. And so that's sort of, this theme is the other theme that's behind the book, trying to think about that both in terms of Iraq, but also more generally what we can learn about it in more general terms. And around the same time that the video came out, ISIS published an article called The Extinction of the Gray Zone in their journal magazine, Dabiq, where they articulate that this is actually something that they are in favor of, that they wanted to achieve this kind of polarization, and the clarity that comes from polarization, right? And so the gray zone, which is their term for that space where there would be plurality, where there would be mixture, and therefore necessity for compromise and all of the kind of political work that goes into compromise because of that plurality. Well, their aim was to extinguish that, or get rid of the gray zone, and in order to clearly demarcate the world into two poles, one which they favor and one which obviously they want to eradicate, and that the first step to eradicating the enemy is to clearly distinguish between friend and enemy, and therefore, at least from a kind of Arendtian perspective, make politics impossible. Right, it's a different kind of orientation underlying it, and so the question is, how does this connect to the iconoclasm? So in the book, and again, somebody asked about which text by Al-Farabi. I mentioned there just the book on religion, but my book, in the first chapter on called Idols, really engages with many of the political works of Al-Farabi and his reflections on the role of images in politics and the necessity of images in politics. And this is particularly interesting given that he's writing in an Islamic milieu, and he's making somewhat subtle but very important arguments that no polity can actually exist without images that orient a populace in some kind of direction, in some kind of shared sense of the good for that political community. But instead of going deeply into Al-Farabi's work today, I'd be happy to talk about it more afterwards. I just bring this image, classic, painting by Poussin of the golden calf, right? The biblical story from Exodus 32, the sort of classic story of idolatry, and as well also a story about the destruction of images. So here we see Aaron leading a kind of celebration around the golden calf. Aaron in the center in white, and then off to the left, you'll see in the dark along the hill, Moses carrying the tablets of the law that he had received in Sinai, and at which time Aaron constructed this calf. And the calf is meant, right, as this kind of orientation for the community. I mean, Aaron actually says that this calf will lead them through the desert, right? They can focus on it and use it as their orientation. Now, when Moses comes down and confronts his brother, asks, "What have you done?" In the biblical text, Aaron says something very interesting. He says, I threw the gold into the fire and out came this calf. I think that this is really, really interesting. There's a subtlety here, right? This ultimately a denial of agency that goes with it, right? That just threw in the gold and automatically the image arose, by which I take the text to suggest, right, that Aaron here is denying agency. And I think that this is a very common problem or common activity when it comes to the images that orient us politically. We often, and this is really one of the main themes of my anthology, Idle Anxiety, we have this anxiety about images because on the one hand, as putting them there at the center of our community, we in a way are subordinating ourselves to them, and yet why subordinate something that is in our power, right? And so that there's this desire for us to experience them as somehow beyond us, right? Now, of course, Moses will have none of this, and he denies Aaron's denial of agency. But Moses, for his part, isn't either really interested in just being honest about, where the attribution is, right? So it's not simply that the calf needs to be properly attributed to human hands, but Moses up on Sinai is seeking some kind of properly transcendent authority, right? An authority that isn't the work of human hands, but is somehow properly transcendent. And so in that sense, both of them in their different ways deny are trying to find a way out of or get away from recognizing the humanly made images that Al-Farabi tells us are so important for organizing political life. Briefly, just on the right, I show this is just a reference to Arnold Schoenberg's early 20th century opera, Moses and Aaron, where Schoenberg retells the story. And in Schoenberg's retelling, when Moses destroys the calf, Aaron rebuts him and says, you think you're destroying this calf, but really what you're doing is you're just making another image for the people. It's a kind of performance, right? So think about it as performance art. This performance of the destruction of the image is itself an image that you are offering to the people, right? Which of course Moses doesn't want to hear. And then Aaron goes on and he says, these laws that you have on these tablets, right? Well, these tablets that you're showing the people, they too are an image. And of course, Moses doesn't want to hear that. And so frustrated, Moses smashes the tablets onto the ground, to which Aaron, of course, responds, well, the smashing of the tablets is itself just another performance and another image, at which point Schoenberg's Moses collapses on the stage and basically says, he says this line, "Oh word, thou word that I lack," right? That he seeks to get away from the image and live in the pure word, and he's incapable of doing that. The opera, Schoenberg wrote both the music and the libretto. The libretto continues into a third act where Moses seems to kind of regain some ground against his brother, but Schoenberg never composed the music to the third act, interestingly. And so when performed today, the opera ends precisely at that moment when Moses is the most dejected, right? Which I think is interesting. And, so thinking about this idea that destruction of images is itself a performance that produces new images. Here are just a couple of other examples. And there are many here, many that one could bring, of images of image destruction, or how the destruction of images serves as a way to produce new images. That's the first point. And then sort of a sub-point of that, how the old images take on a kind of role within the new image, become a kind of prop in the new image, or the so to speak. So the main image here, this is a woodcut by Hochenberg, depicting the Beldenstern, which is the destruction of images during the Protestant Reformation in Antwerp, right? And we see people pulling down statues from the top of the columns, right? So under one regime, under a Catholic regime, those images served to orient people in their community and give sense to the community as to what their highest aims were and concerns were. And now those images that had once served the Catholic regime are being shown, right, in their destruction as kind of props in this new image, which is meant to orient a new community and be a kind of founding image for a new regime. And then off to the right, we have something similar with the famous removal of Saddam Hussein's statue, right, in Baghdad. This image, the removal itself, right, what is not so special? There were many removals of statues. What made this removal special was that it was captured on film and that it was shown throughout the world in real time. And so what's important is not so much the destruction, but rather the image of that destruction. And I bring the image on the bottom of the removal of Confederate statues to raise this question. And as well, like, to what extent is the removal what's important, or is it the image of that removal that is more important? And that itself is actually something that's debated. There are cases both of removals sort of in the middle of the night, such that no image of that removal is made. And then there are very, very public removals and destructions. And so at the very least, I want to raise this question, right? What is this line between iconoclasm and iconoclasm as the basis for image production? Now, to say that ISIS is involved or was involved in image production, right, should come as no surprise, in that ISIS was particularly well known for its image savviness. Just to demonstrate this, also just for fun, these are 3 cartoons that were submitted for a contest, an Iranian-based contest for Daesh or ISIS-related cartoons. Many of the cartoons showed focused on ISIS's image savviness. On the left, we have Daesh, which is the Arabic acronym for ISIS, receiving a star on Hollywood Boulevard, flanked by a Saudi driving his limousine and an Israeli soldier guarding him. This is very much within the Iranian conception of Daesh. in the second image, we have, right, the idea that the execution videos were incredibly well staged for the camera. And then finally on the right, and perhaps the most important for my work, right, this image that suggests that the Facebook F, right, here a bloodied Facebook F is an equivalent to the sword that is held by the other Daesh soldier. So here, this in a way, thinking about this idea that I showed with the Hochenberg Beldensturm image, this idea that old images, and specifically political images, right? Images that were used for establishing some kind of political identity, an assertion of political power, get transformed through their destruction into new images that do the same work, but now in a new way, right? And so here we have an example of other palace reliefs from the Palace of Nimrud, another Assyrian palace. This from a video that ISIS released shortly after the one that I started with. And so we see here the palace reliefs, which in their day served to undergird the politics of the Assyrian regime, blown up with these barrel bombs. And in the process of them being blown up, right, they then appear on a new kind of wall, or at least I'm dating myself, right? So now I believe, I mean, first of all, by putting up Facebook here, I'm dating myself, but also initially what was called a wall, I believe now it's called a feed, right? But the wall is nice, I think, because we have the palace wall right now being shifted over to a virtual or electronic wall. And so the thought here is that, in a sense, with their videos, ISIS was engaged in producing a new kind of palace, like the Assyrian palace in its political orientation and its attempt to establish the foundations of a new regime. But unlike the physical palaces of the Assyrian kings that they were destroying, the new palace appeared everywhere and nowhere on the screens that we carry around, our computer and phones and et cetera, right? And so it's through this virtual palace that ISIS, in a way, updated the idea of the Assyrian palace. And like the Assyrian palace that showed many different aspects of Assyrian political life in order to give a full sense of what it meant to be Assyrian and what it meant to be a subject of Assyria. Likewise, ISIS produced videos, a whole range of videos, right? So the video of Iconoclasm that I started with is just one video of a whole range of videos, from ranging on the one hand from the gruesome execution videos to, on the other, videos that showed the excellence of the healthcare system in ISIS-occupied Syria, right? That this whole range of videos, right, constitute the kind of new virtual palace that ISIS was creating. And so what's important to realize here is that iconoclasm, or specifically the images of iconoclasm that do this, that I've been arguing does this political work, never does it alone. It always does it within a larger set of images. And that's actually true even of the Hochenberg image that I showed you of the Beldensturm. That image itself circulated initially in a whole series of woodcuts that would have been bought together, and only one of them was about iconoclasm, but all of them together sort of were giving you a sense of the new polity or the new regime that was being formed. And so just to give you a sense of this, right, to do the work really with respect to ancient Assyria, of where this image of iconoclasm fits within the larger project of Assyrian political imagery, would require analyzing the entirety, at least of say the one palace that we're concerned with here, of Khorsabad. But just to venture in a little bit in this direction. Here we have, a larger segment of the wall where that image of iconoclasm that I started with, you can see right down at the bottom center of the image, is found. And we can learn a little bit more about this image by looking at the context. And so here, this is a bit of speculation. We don't know for certain, but above the image that we started with, right, we have this image of two larger figures with a large scale. And that has suggested to scholars that what we see in the iconoclasm is not simply the destruction of the image of a king, but the transformation of the image of a king, and therefore the image of another polity's image, right? The image that had served as sort of the focus point for another polity is now being transformed back into the raw materials, specifically the gold and silver, that it had been made out of. And so it's being broken down into the raw materials, the gold and silver, which will then be weighed, and then will be carried back to Assyria, like these other objects that are this booty of that metal booty that's being taken out of the temple here that we see burning, which then in turn will be transformed into the Assyrian palace that the person who's viewing this image, right, is standing in at the moment, right? So there's this kind of reflexivity involved in what is being depicted. So that's the first point. The second point is that here, sort of on the center top, we see these three images. One sort of larger magistrate sitting down facing these two standing figures, and you can tell by what they're holding that these are scribes. One with a cuneiform tablet, therefore inscribing information in Akkadian, and one with parchment or probably papyrus, marking the person as a scribe in Aramaic. The Assyrian Empire used both of these languages for administrative purposes. And what's likely being recorded here, right, is the booty that's being acquired. And so, and we have texts like this that survive, that show that the Assyrian had good bookkeeping and that they were, and therefore what we have here is a transformation not only of a political image into raw material, but then that raw material into data that is then part of the bureaucratic system of the Assyrian kingdom. And I mention this because I think this is a very, simple, this ancient system of transformation of images into data is a simple version of what we are engaged in today through the production of data and data mining on social media and other online platforms. And so those images of image destruction, right, that iconoclasm that was put onto the internet, by means of putting it onto the internet, right, it was a way of producing data for the data miners, and in the process, therefore, producing wealth for those data miners and for the platforms upon which the images appeared. Okay, so looks like I will make it in time of 10 minutes and try to get through this. Just a couple more slides. Now, I talked, a bit about this polarization and the fragility of maintaining pluralistic political communities, right? And here I want to sort of show an image now, being brought in some of the more digital technology and social media themes of my work, an image that sort of should remind you of those images of the maps of Baghdad after the invasion of Iraq. So this is an image from a now defunct project that was run by the Wall Street Journal called Blue Feed, Red Feed. and I put it here just in a way to stand in for something that I think we all know and we've all heard about, right? Which is the kind of way that social media has a tendency of producing whether we want to call it echo chambers or separating us into worlds where we end up, by means of our screens, seeing homogenized worlds. We end up seeing something that actually has produced a kind of homogenization that, and we experience it in a way as our world. Or the more and more that we experience our world through our screen, right? The more and more our world gets reflected to us in a way that we actually want it to appear. And this is a function of algorithms. And I mean, none of this is new to you. I'm just trying to sort of make some connections here, right? And so if we think of iconoclasm, or the aim of iconoclasm, as a purifying of our political worlds, of the images that we want to deem as idols, or we want to deem as illicit or inappropriate, or images that we do not want to have functioning in our worlds and making any claims to kind of political orientation, right? That we want to eradicate our world of any of these images that somehow disturb us, bother us with respect to our political ideals, then there's a kind of iconoclasm going on social media that I think is far more extensive than any iconoclasm that's taken place with a hammer. And this is an iconoclasm that I call algorithmic iconoclasm, and it takes place by means of our clicking fingers, right? And so that each time that we inform the algorithms of our social media of what we like, right? Those algorithms will continue to send us the images more of those images that fit the world as we want to see it, and fewer and fewer images of the world as we might not want to see it, right? And so our worlds become purified of those images that we don't want to see. And so we engage, even if we don't realize it, right? We don't feel like we're smashing images with hammers the way that we might if we took a hammer into a museum. And yet through our clicking fingers, each time we like an image or share it or comment on it or what have you, right? We are purifying our worlds in this kind of iconoclastic, in an iconoclastic sense. And I think that we should be, here like a little bit of editorializing, I think we should be concerned about this. With if Hannah Arendt's ideas based in Aristotle about the necessity of plurality for proper political life are correct, right? And yet, as we know, that plurality is incredibly fragile, and therefore we need to work hard to achieve it and to maintain it and to sustain it. Well, this kind of iconoclasm that sends us into these homogenized worlds, right, is a challenge to that kind of actual political plurality that we should be aware of. And I mean, here at the top, I'll just read it. It's slightly different context, but recently in an interview, Mark Zuckerberg, realizing not so much this specific issue, but just generally how social media like Facebook has been destructive politically, and in terms of our political fabric. He mentioned people are going to just get angrier and angrier and will eventually say, screw it, take a hammer to the whole thing. Which of course is, I was happy to see this use of hammers, and there's so many hammers in my work. But at the same time, I'm actually would want to suggest that I'm not so sure, because I think that the more and more that social media gives us worlds that we feel comfortable in, right? Because precisely, why do we want to inhabit these worlds of homogenized worlds? Because we feel more comfortable in them. Everybody feels more comfortable in a world where everyone agrees with them. I think that it's going to be, I'm not sure that we're going to want to take a hammer to it, precisely because it appeals to certain base, sort of key sort of human desires. And even if those aren't necessarily our best desires, it doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to so easily overcome them. And so I think that at least I hope that through the work that I'm trying to do is we can try and think about the implications of that. The last 5 minutes, just want to suggest an alternative to smashing images, right? So that if smashing images, as I've been suggesting, is ultimately a form of producing new images, and therefore the kind of cycle continues in this way, is there some type of alternative? And for this, I turn to a late work by Friedrich Nietzsche, The Twilight of the Idols, or How Man Can Philosophize with a Hammer. And in this work, Nietzsche suggests that a hammer can be used for something different than smashing. He says that a hammer can be wielded like a tuning fork, that one can tap idols in order to reveal their hollowness and yet not smash them and destroy them. And Nietzsche, of course, is thinking specifically about those grand idols of Western metaphysics. But I think that that his thought can be extended to some of the things that I've been talking about, right? Which is, how do we develop the capacity for tapping the images that surround us, right? So for realizing the hollowness, the emptiness of images, and yet at the same time, realize that, as Al-Farabi has informed us, the necessity of images, that it's not possible to just eradicate them simply because they're false, because there's no way to escape them and still maintain political lives. And so the thought here, right, is that building on Nietzsche's insight, I want to suggest, and this is in a way something that I think that my whole book tries to do, is that we can tap images against one another as a way of sounding them out. So the idea is that no image is perfectly true. All images hide something. All images, and again, I'm here focusing on images that specifically have some type of political salience, are meant to orient a group politically. All images put something forward and leave something out, right? It's the nature of an image, right? Otherwise, right, what we would get, right, there's a famous story of Borges, right, about how such a perfect map was finally designed, right, that was exactly the same size as the world, right? That something has to be left out in an image, right? And so here's just an example of what I mean about tapping images against one another in order to hear the hollowness of each image. So here are two images that seek to teach us how we should behave in a museum. They show us, right, what proper comportment in a museum is. On the left is an image from a 19th century, from the London Illustrated News, showing the Nineveh room in the British Museum shortly after many of the recently excavated sculptures from northern Iraq were brought to London. And we see here, right, an image that seems to tell us that the proper way to engage with these objects, right, is to walk around slowly. Ideally, perhaps, you know, if you're a man in a top hat, you should probably be quiet. Maybe if you're a mother, you bring your kids to show them the image, right? Or you go on a date. Maybe these two people here are on a date. Who knows? And you can look at these images. You can think about them. You can learn from them. You can appreciate them. You can, you know, tell your buddy how much you know about them and impress your buddy. And that's what these images are for. And this is what museums are for. And they build a kind of community by means of that kind of engagement, right? Of course, on the right, we have a different kind of way of behaving in a museum. Now, when the image on the right came out, a lot of articles immediately argued, right, that the kind of destruction that took place in the Mosul Museum was appropriate because, and there's truth to this, the Mosul Museum, like many other museums in Iraq, were institutions that were brought to Iraq as part of a colonial project, and that the destruction in the museums belonged to a larger, decolonizing project. And so to smash the colonizing institutions of Iraq belongs to this project of a kind of redemptive process. And like I said, as far as that goes, there's truth in that image, right? And if we looked at that image on its own, right, we might just entirely embrace it. And my suggestion is that if we put it, though, next to the image on the left, we might be reminded that, well, there might be some benefits to a different kind of orientation and behavior in a museum, right, that seems to be conveyed in the image on the left. At the same time, if we were only looking at the image on the left, we might forget something by putting it next to the image on the right, we are reminded of, which is that everything that we see on the left itself rests on the British Empire and all that that entails, right? And so here we have one example of how we might be able to take two images that present very different views, try to achieve very different orientations. By putting them next to each other, we can actually free ourselves a bit from the power of each one in order to be able to have a kind of position of judgment about them, right? Which I think is incredibly important to cultivate as political beings. And just this is the last thought. The problem, right, is that the more we inhabit worlds like these, the less we will actually become familiar with different, with images that make different such statements, right? And we will no longer have the arsenal, so to speak, to do the kind of tapping that I think is so essential as political citizens. And so with that, I sort of I'll leave things there. Hopefully I didn't speak too much over time, and hopefully we can have some discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aaron. And I think, yes, there are some questions. I don't know if, Amir, your question got answered.
Oh, I have many questions right now, but I cannot articulate them. So if I get your email, I can write to you and then ask you kindly. Thank you so much.
Okay, perfect. Okay, then we go with Eden.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. Yes, like Amir, I mean, my mind is like full of ideas right now. I'm not sure how I can articulate a question, but I was thinking about the relationship between terrorism or radicalization and echo chambers actually a lot. Because if a person cannot find a way to express themselves, they can easily get violent, right?
Yeah.
So this is the basic thing. And when you put the image of Mark Zuckerberg, I immediately thought about that. And actually, like, there are some scholars, namely, I'll name two scholars, Gilles Kepel and Olivier Roy. They were also talking about a formation of ISIS and how maybe it's not a good idea to talk about radicalization of Islam, but Islamization of radicalization, which is actually true, because you have radicalization all around the world in many means. And when you,
I like that. I'd not heard that before, but I like that. So, but go on. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you put when you put this into the context of echo chambers, and especially the use of social media, it makes perfect sense actually. Because as you mentioned, I mean, ISIS is using like a lot of great production skills for its propaganda. But about destruction, actually, my question is about destruction, because it's not only about, I mean, we all know that each civilization performs a way of destruction to the previous civilization or their remnants. We had it in Italy, for example, after when they converted to Christianity, they destructed all the pagan sculptures. So it's not about culture or religion. It's just a universal thing. But here you were talking about the Islamic, the specific museum, and you were talking about colonization. But we also know that ISIS also destructed a lot of pagan sites as well in Syria and in Iraq, especially the ancient cities. So how do we make the distinction, like between the because they destruct many things actually, but how do we see the motivation there? Because how do we know that it's completely related to colonialism or it's something really old? Sorry.
Right. Okay. Thanks for the question. Right. So the first thing I would say is that I wouldn't want to. Your last phrase was, "How do we know that it's completely related?" I think those were your words, right? And so fundamentally, I try to avoid any type of single explanations of anything, right? So I try to sort of keep things as complicated as possible because I don't think it can be reduced to sort of one answer or whatever, right? And so I think that there are a lot of different levels. So in the second chapter of my book, which I don't like, the presentation I just gave you didn't really pull that much material from it, but it's called Museums. And that's the chapter where I really go into the question of how ancient Near Eastern objects have acquired different kinds of meanings and a whole range of different meanings since their rediscovery in the 19th century, and how they belong to colonial projects, both French and British, and then eventually German and American as well, colonial projects, how they belong to national projects, how they belong to a kind of anti-national avant-garde projects, how they, and a whole range of different types of things. And so there's no easy answer, right? So I can't say specifically, right? Like, I want to keep open the possibility, right, that there's there is a colonial valence, right, with that can be the source of animosity. There's also a kind of Saddam Hussein valence that could be the source of animosity. Now, this is complicated because it's unlikely. I mean, if we're trying to exactly understand these particular people in the Mosul Museum video, right, which at the end of the day became no longer my goal, right? If we're trying to understand precisely the motivations of these particular people, I don't know, right? Like maybe they think that they're doing something because they're doing it for religious purposes, right? Maybe they think they're doing it because they're anti-colonial project. They're almost certainly not themselves like native Iraqis, right? And so it's unlikely that they would have, for example, an anti-Saddam valence, but that's also a possible one, because Saddam Hussein perhaps was the leader who took these ancient Assyrian images, and he put so much money into their restoration and built up all these museums, but he did it in such a way that his persona was always connected with it, right? So as I quote somebody in my book, a guy who runs an Iraqi who runs a grocery shop in Chicago that I spoke to, and I told him I was writing this book about the destruction of the images of these objects, and he told me, "Oh, who cares about that stuff? It's all just Saddam propaganda," because he had been bussed to view those those sites, right, as a kid, as part of the propaganda schooling that he received as an Iraqi. So it's very, I guess I would just say that I want to kind of keep the kind of plethora of possibilities open, even if that's obvious that lacks a kind of the satisfaction of clarity.
Thank you.
Okay, then Jamal.
Yes, thank you very much. And let me know if my internet connection drops. It's not the most stable at the moment. So I have a...
Where are you, Jamal?
What do you say?
Where are you?
At the moment, I'm in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, but with a very shitty Wi-Fi. But
okay.
We have all been on the internet in the last week, and this is also what my question refers to. With something I'm struggling with when when I see the social media behavior regarding the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and that's what you said about by clicking you purify the world. I thought of the infographic as the new icon almost, and I just wanted to get your opinion. How do you in these days behave on the internet? Because it was almost like how to deal with this, because I came into a situation where a friend was even asking me like, man, you're not posting about this, like how could you? And this was very disturbing for me, and right. I have really mixed feelings, so I'm just curious right. what your ideas
okay are, so since you asked, I'm happy to share, and I don't know, what I have to say may or may not, be welcome. I don't know all of you, right? So I'm just sort of thrown in here, right? But it's interesting giving this presentation at this moment, and so in a way, I'm glad that you asked the question, because I think that it's very, very relevant, and I think otherwise, it would without talking about it would be to sort of leave the elephant in the room. So in a sense, behind this entire project, for me, behind the book, was my experience during on Facebook 7 years ago during the last Gaza war. And an early version of the introduction even talked about that explicitly, and then I decided I wanted to leave the issue kind of not made explicit in the book, but we can make it explicit in this setting and at this moment, right? And I think, hopefully what you can gather about me from the little you know about me and what I presented is that I'm very concerned and I desire a kind of complicating of situations and becoming aware of where simplifications take place. And this is sort of what we talked about, or the idea about the freedom that one can get from certain images that simplify, right, that by tapping them against one another. And so as it happens, my own Facebook feed is not very much like the Facebook feed of the Wall Street Journal's blue feed, red feed, homogenized thing, right? And I'm not claiming any kind of, this is not my own, it's not thanks to me or any value on my part. It just happens to be the case that my childhood, I was raised in a modern Orthodox Jewish background. And so I have a bunch of Facebook friends, though people I haven't necessarily spoken to in years, Facebook friends who are very close-mindedly pro-Israel and Zionist in a very, very simplistic way. And I've spent my entire adult life within the academy, where I think, as I'm sure you know, right, the standard views are quite different than that.
Okay.
And so I see both.
Aaron, we have to wrap it up.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh my God. Okay.
I think we can spend a long time talking about this.
Anyway, right. So just to say, I think it's important to try to be able to tap the views against each other to sort of help us avoid falling into the trap of images that leave a lot out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Aaron. I know that you have typed your email in case any of the participants would like to be in touch with you. So thank you very much. We hope to have you soon again in the program.
Thanks so much.
I really appreciate it.
Sorry we ran out of time like this.
No problem.
I'm sorry I didn't get to your question really properly.
No problem. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay. So I'm gonna